So as I said before, everyone, we know that each person reads the Bible from a particular lens that relates to how they were raised and what kinds of things have happened to them in life. And we've also been handed a way of reading the Bible and different ways of interpreting the Bible from theologians down through the years, often without us even being made aware that what we know is an interpretation. And many of those voices have been white men. When others have approached the text and done good work studying it, they sometimes find different insights and understandings that are more helpful to our time and place, or to a particular group or groups of people. So our question today, as you know, is what you might teach us that has been meaningful for you. I know Judges 11, like I talked about in the beginning, is the text you'll be speaking on, with constructive insight from your lived experience and knowledge and social location, which includes a lot of different things. So I want to just hand it over to you and let you take this time to tell us about that. Does that work?
Yes, it does. Thank you. Thank you, Holly, for this invitation. I am thrilled to be a part of this, this work. So one of the things that I do with biblical text is read them from what we call a post-colonial perspective. And that's simply a way of asking, what is empire doing within the biblical text, and what has empire done with the biblical text? And how our experiences of empire in the modern world reflect what we're seeing in the biblical text. And our experiences of modern empire is wide and varied, and in many instances we weren't aware of them. But for my own purposes, of course, I will name it within the confines of sort of racial capitalism. And by racial capitalism, it's the reality that resulted in me being a person of African descent, but never having visited the continent of Africa, or unable to trace my lineage beyond a certain period, primarily because racial capitalism engaged in this practice of enslavement and deportation and trafficking of people of African descent. So where I'm born and I grew up in the Caribbean, and my place within the world is all shaped by that. Shaped by the fact that I then embrace a space, a physical space that I call home, that used to be occupied by indigenous people, but who are no longer there because, again, racial capitalism committed genocide against those people. And there are a bunch of other things that I could go on with, but let me just work with those for a while, because those are the ones that have become important for me in reading Judges 11. Because Judges 11 is set within the story of the conquest of the land. And we like to talk about it from a reading of the Bible as the promised land. And paying attention to all of these idealistic images of the promised land, forgetting that it was land that was occupied by people. And so it wasn't empty, neither was it among the best land, but there were people there and they had the cultures there. But what then occurs is this sense that, oh, these people aren't right. They aren't morally correct. There's something wrong with them, and we are morally correct, therefore we need to push them out. And that's the narrative that you will see in books of Deuteronomy and certainly Joshua, and then of course it continues into Judges as well. And it's an important thing for us to interrupt, because those narratives shape us. Because ultimately when we read them, we are being invoked and asked to then put ourselves on the side of the we who are the morally superior ones. Now, what that does for someone like me, with the legacy that I described, it asks, am I on the side of the people who are performing the conquest? Because my own story and the legacy that I have inherited is of the people who have been dispossessed, and the people whose identities have been stolen and then pushed out. So it's an important thing for us to pay attention to, because when we read the story in Judges 11 and the whole book of Judges and parts of Joshua and others, this issue is pushed into the background in the telling of the story, and what comes into the foreground are the deeds of valor, like Joshua, or Jephthah. Jephthah's military abilities and all of the stuff becomes the center of attention. And we see nothing or very little of the indigenous people and the people now that he's fighting against. So the question tends to, for me, in this case and maybe others, is if I am to become a part of this community of people who gather around the Bible, and the community that draws faith and inspiration from the Bible, what's my part? Where is my role? And if the story of Judges 11 and Jephthah is a story of the God who then says, I love you and you belong to this part of this community, then I have to ask, which parts of me is God loving and which parts are not? Because then it seems to me to belong to that community of love, or to be affirmed by God, means rejecting everything that I am and therefore pretending in some ways to be something else. Loving aspects of the people that I'm in community with that have been detrimental to my story. And so the challenge is then, for me, is naming texts like these as representing a God that is too small, and demonstrating in many ways the dangers of narrow thinking and co-opting God into those narrow thinking. And that's an important piece of reading those texts, for me, of in some ways pushing against them and pointing out how they have been shaped in ways to present a very, very narrow, small God, hoping that when we read them, we could say, wow, the God we are experiencing now is much more capacious and expansive than this. And therefore, this perhaps is, at best, a cautionary tale as to what we don't do. Because it's not just something that happened in the ancient world. These are tendencies that occur today. So a little bit more about the story of Jephthah. So Jephthah, of course, is one of those judges. And he's brought into leadership primarily because the community is facing an intractable challenge. And Jephthah is presented in the earlier chapter as this very shrewd person. He's smart, he's a negotiator, he prefers not to go to war, but he's forced into war. And it is, again, a centering him and his story. And in his story is, look, this guy is going to be as gentle as he wants to be and ruthless as necessary. But when he gets into the middle of the battle, he ends up in this bargain with God, basically saying, look, I'm going to offer you a gift if you make me win. And Jephthah wins. And when he gets home, because the bargain was whatever comes out of the door to greet me, that's going to be the sacrifice to God. And that turns out to be his daughter. Now, these are the places where it's important for us to ask, why are we being told this story? Why is the story about Jephthah, when all that we're seeing is him, and we don't get enough of a space to engage his victims? Here now is his vow having a detrimental impact upon his daughter. And of course, he feels the pain of this. And as Holly recounts, the daughter goes away basically saying, look, I need to mourn this reality that I'm going to die as a sacrifice. No, this is where we need to stop and say, sacrifice? Are we reading exactly what we're reading? That this man is willing to sacrifice his own daughter. Now, if you're outraged by this, at this point in time, if you've started reading from Genesis, this is not the first time. Because the first outrage comes in Genesis 22 when Abraham takes upon himself, having been told by God that he should sacrifice his son. So part of one of the things that we have to just be asking, did they have child sacrifice in ancient Israel? And the answer to that question seems to be possibly yes, because Abraham doesn't seem bothered by the request from God to go sacrifice his son. He doesn't. It doesn't seem as if he is outraged at the notion, and neither is Jephthah. Jephthah's trouble is that it is his daughter. If one of his household slaves had come, he wouldn't have had a problem. If it was one of his neighbors, he wouldn't have had a problem. So human sacrifice doesn't seem to be a problem here. Yet with all of that murkiness, what we get is a centering of this brave man of valor, military warrior who keeps his word. This man who is so centered here is a different set of values. And one wants to ask, where are those values coming from? Where are the stories that tell us these kind of masculine values are the things that we need to be doing? I don't know that the Bible underwrites them, because one has to ask the question, did God agree with Jephthah? Did you see a pinky swear between Jephthah and God? There's nothing. Now, of course, I tell students when they read this is to be careful of causal relationships or correlation. Jephthah says, look, I'm arguing this thing with God. We don't hear God saying, yep, go for it. But then we hear God gave him the victory. Does it mean that God agreed with the bargain? Many people want to say yes. But the notion, the idea that we want to say yes is we want God to co-sign the conquest. We want God to co-sign the character of the man. We want God to do all of those very different things. It is the way in which now what we're doing is shrinking God. If God for us was someone who was anti-conquest, anti the genocide of indigenous people, if the God we imagined was that big, then we would not be willing to center and celebrate the ways in which Jephthah has been celebrated throughout the history of interpretation of this text. And in other words, what we have done is to position God on the side of modern empire. That the efforts of one people to move into another geographical space and displace people on the premise that we are superior. We can use this land much better. We could develop it much further. In fact, we could drag you and bring you along to civilization. Those are the narratives that are shaping out the way in which we read this text. And in the process, diminishing and shrinking God. But here's this other thing to pay attention to. Why many of the male scholars, I mean, up until the 1980s, the scholarship on this chapter was heavily centered among men who didn't see any problems at all. But one of the things why the male scholars didn't see a problem with the text is the fact that the daughter seems to go along. So yeah, with the idea, so there's this moment of grief that both the father and the daughter experience, and of course she has this month-long sojourn to engage that grief, but ultimately comes back and says, look, do what you need to do. Now, some people will point out to us we don't actually see the act of sacrifice being committed. And this is an interesting space when we start to look at 17th and 18th century artwork on this passage. And many of the artists are basically drawing and painting pictures of her being burnt at the stake, in some ways reflecting the cultural context of the time. So we don't have anything saying he did it. She came back and presented herself. That doesn't diminish what we're faced with. Because just as problematic as the Abraham sacrifice of Isaac would have been, this is also problematic that the fathers don't seem to be bothered by it. And they seem willing and eager to go for it as part of some kind of virtue. But she supports it, is the important thing. And with that, what we get from a number of people is, oh, wow. Well, if the daughter willingly makes herself the sacrifice, then it can't be wrong. It can't be too bad. He probably did what was right. He's a man of his word, and he kept his word, regardless of whether that word is problematic. So this is something that we need to interrogate. But it does seem to me, it sounds always like to me, well, women don't complain about sexual harassment. So if they don't complain about sexual harassment, then it has to be right, okay? Or if people of color says, don't go to the route of defund the police because we want the police. So it means that the systemic manifestations of violence against Black people by the police is fine. What it does, it always misses, is this idea that the victims of oppression are quite often supportive of the system that oppresses them. We don't have to say something is right because the people who are its victims don't complain. We know it is wrong. And so what we have is this inability to name it, because what we have done is really shrunk God, shrunk the scope of the sacred text to fit in with some dominant ideas and some dominant views that benefit a few people, dragging everyone else along with it. So part of what my post-colonial lens does is to say to me, I can't fit into this text. And to say, here are other people who will have problems fitting in as well. And to show how systems of oppression have been co-opting the victims and co-opting different kinds of people, or people who are in middle positions, like Jephthah's daughter, because Jephthah's daughter isn't pushing against the system. She's not a complete victim of it in some ways, but she's there as the daughter of an elite warrior, in many ways not paying attention to others who might be on the wrong side. And this, of course, there's a lot of gendered stuff that's going on here, because it's the way within which elite women don't always dismantle the system that from which they benefit, and they become much more problematic in that position than anything else. So here we are with this deeply troubling text. And of course, the thing I will tell you is that there are several more. There are a whole lot more like them in the Bible. And so we have to ask the question, is then the Bible any good? For me, I answer that question to say, yes, of course, certainly it is good. Because I will go back to what I started with, in that for people like me to belong to this space, what we constantly have to do is to keep expanding the way in which we conceive and think of the space. Constantly conceiving, reconceiving on how we think of God. Because if we ever restrict God to what's on the pages of the book, if God is only what is represented in the book, then of course that God is too small, contained by a book, defined by words, and defined by language. And the transcendence of God has to be such that it can go beyond those limitations. But then there's the other thing that we also have to do, is if we want to contain God by the limits of our interpretation, that is something that has to happen. Because quite often the limits of those interpretations are shaped by Western European ideals. So Greek myths and Greek mythology pushed the bravery as a big virtue. And so for us, we could read Jephthah in the mold of the Greek heroes. His heroism resembles those that we'll read in Greek myths. We can think of Jephthah and his idea, his insistence that I gave my word and I cannot take it back, consonant with what we see of heroic values from other types of cultural systems. But there is something that has to be asked. But what if your word was detrimental to the interest of others? Why is your integrity superior to another person's life? And those are big questions that we have to ask. And the fact that we do not ask those questions is because we have elevated integrity to a point where it then gets unquestioned. Regardless of what the person has said, the fact that they're keeping their word is much more important than what the word is. When we are at that place, we have been corrupted by something other than the ideals that we are looking for and fighting for. So for me, that's important to kind of push and pry apart how a reading of a text like this is informed, yes, in some sense, by what we're actually seeing, but we have decided to now shift the pieces around in the text and bring some things into the foreground because a number of cultural impulses tell us these are the places we need to go. And we have remained silent and complicit with the text by its erasure of the victims of conquest, the military battles that just engage in genocide, and the fact that we read it and look at it that way. So I have to then ask, well, how do I bring God into all of this? And for God to come in there, God has to be so much bigger than what is represented and seen. Okay, so let me pause here for a while, and we probably could have some more conversation. Holly, I don't know if you have, and see how our timing is. So.
Yeah, one of the questions, thank you so much for what you've given us so far. I have a comment here from Adrian that's saying, I love the challenge to ask why we are shrinking our idea of who God is, which is the main point. Where do those values come from, and why is this the lens that many of us were taught to read the text in? And I'm thinking that the limitedness has to do with the limits of colonialism and racism and sexism and heterosexism. And that's what limits our ability to be able to make God bigger.
Yes. So, in many ways, we think, we like to think that the Bible is sort of like this primary text that we read, and it's the only one. And therefore, we then come out of that, having read the Bible, and we go into the world and be shaped by those values. But it's hardly it's really the other way around. We come to the Bible having been shaped by values that are already existent in the world. And what we're doing is we try to make the Bible conform to those values. In many ways, we're doing that. And we like to think, well, no, we are just kind of picking up where other people have left off. But no, we're not. In fact, if we're picking up where other people have left off, and you've heard me say this in many ways, we're picking up from 16th and century white Europeans. So yeah, you're kind of picking up from where Luther leaves off. And we have to name Luther within the limits of his cultural, geographical, religious, political space. And understand that those are limits. Not to say that there aren't things that are useful that's coming out of it, but there are limits. So yeah, that's part of the hard thing. And it's just got. I mean, for me, it's just an open recognition and naming that that's where we are at.
Yeah, because the danger in not naming that that's where we're at is to not then realize that when we look at text and read what's centered in it, and you have this, the co-signing the conquest and co-signing empire are things that haven't changed, right? Since, like that happened in the Bible, and we get to tell those stories from this vantage point that also feeds into a story of manifest destiny, and also feeds into even, I don't know, redlining and all kinds of other things that we justify to privilege one group of people over another.
Yeah. No. It's remarkable how I don't want to say innocuous, how a practice like redlining could participate in the same logic as manifest destiny. And there will be people who would say, but no, they're not. They're so very different. One is about military stuff and so on, but it's a logic that's the same. Mm-hmm. And then you could bring down that issue of redlining, and you could go even further with it into the question of other housing practices and the implications that has upon education and a number of different a number of different things. So it's the logic that we have to always be paying attention to. So the impact might be a little bit different, the methodology may be different, but it's the same set of ideas. One group deserves something more than another.
Yeah.
And they deserve it by virtue of who they are, and they should be dispossessed by virtue of who they are. However, we determine that. And that's very easy to do within the Bible because those binaries are so strong. And we have to just be paying attention to them because we can exacerbate the binaries that we see in the Bible.
Steed, I want to thank you for taking time with us on this Sunday morning, especially. I know it's a busy time of the year at the start of school year. I know what academia feels like. I know it's a little crazy making. And I'm sure that you have several students who are wondering if they're going to make it. You should tell them that at least I did, so they might be okay.
Yeah, I keep telling them, as you know, my thing is as long as you do what I tell you to do, you'll be fine.
So I just have a few fun questions for you to end with. One of them is, what book, fiction or nonfiction, has really captured your attention lately? Or what book do you really wish would capture white people's attention right now?
Oh, lately, because I was reading it again last night, and this is probably my 5th reading of Beloved by Toni Morrison, and then just reading those early chapters. This was like, oh gosh, I missed seeing what the level of emotional pain that's in there. I mean, you know, the book starts off with this notion of being haunted by the death of this child who was killed by her mother at 2 years old to save her from enslavement.
Oh.
And I in all of my previous readings, I never got the weight, the emotional weight of that. And that's something I think people should capture, because again, if ever at all you succumb to the idea of, well, the slaves were happy, you know, this is something that will push against that. If or it wasn't, or any kind of, well, slavery wasn't so bad, look how well you turned out, because you could have been living in Africa and it could have been, you know, you want to read stuff like that to get those notions out of your mind. So,
yeah, Toni Morrison particularly, because she refused to write for the white gaze. So
yeah. Oh my gosh, last day when she died, and I listened to that interview with the woman who basically said to her, why are you not writing for broader audiences or white people? Yeah, I mean, that's an interview you need to see, and just see Toni Morrison's response, as judicious as she could possibly be without screaming. Yeah.
Tell us, okay, so Beloved, everyone, read Beloved by Toni Morrison. What song always makes you dance?
Oh, what song always makes you dance? I don't know. I run to very rhythmic music, so all of them probably do. Because I have 3 or 4 days a week, there's a whole lot of very rhythmic danceable music that's on my playlist that I am spending about an hour with. So those are the ones.
Honestly, I do a tiny bit of running too, but mostly just 1 mile to donuts. Most of my people know that. And I have a playlist too, and they probably don't know that one of the songs that's on there is Pour Some Sugar on Me, which I find very amusing to run to donuts where I'm about to get sugar.
You did, I always remember, you did an Old Testament playlist.
Yes.
You had compiled an Old Testament. I must see if I could find it, or if you probably have it, of all these wonderful songs cued to references in the Bible.
Yeah.
So maybe, but many of them may not have been dancing songs. So.
Probably not. All right. Do you have a favorite podcast to share with us?
Oh, my podcast is Fresh Air. That's the one I try to get ever so often. Hidden Brain is another one that I also pay attention to, but Fresh Air is just a breath. And I realize that I get a lot more interesting coverage of political issues there than I would get from regular news media. So that's where I
Fresh Air and Hidden Brain, everyone.
Hidden Brain, yeah. Yeah.
And if heaven exists and God has a voice, what would you like to hear God say when you arrive?
See, it wasn't so bad.
That's good. And do you have a poem or a quote that you can close us out with that speaks to you this time anyway?
So I picked up some of these poems after 30 years old, and it's hard to, what happens when your brain after 30 years, you don't memorize things as well. The poem that I really resonate a whole lot with is one by Derek Walcott called Love After Love.
Mm-hmm.
And in that poem, it ends where he basically says, after all, your pain and so on of failing in love, one of the things that you actually need to do is to fall in love with yourself. And the time will come when you would look in the mirror and see yourself and say, hey, come, sit, eat. Here is bread. Here is wine.
I should use that before communion sometime.
Yes, it has this wonderful Eucharistic piece at the end, but it is fundamentally about just coming to the point where you say, you know what, I love you, and saying that to yourself.
Yeah, that's lovely. That's a good close for us before we head into prayer. So I'm going to close us out in prayer before we do announcements here. Thank you again for what you've shared with us today. And now you can go back and look at the comments to see what people had to say to you.
Sure. Right. Yeah.